Of all the white-collar crimes out there, few are as sinister as the Ponzi scheme. The favorite of Wall Street wolves and crooked investors, Ponzi schemes are essentially investment scams that promise insanely high rates of return to investors with little risk. They achieve this by using the money from new investors to pay off the old ones. Yet no matter how convincing the scam is, eventually it will fall apart. Here are the top 15 most crazy Ponzi schemes. Number 15. Karitas. Karitas is often cited by experts as being one of the few examples of a pure Ponzi scheme. Initiated in Romania in 1992, Karitas convinced a total of about 3 million Romanians that they would receive 8 times their investment in just 90 days by handing them over their hard-earned cash. Karitas was able to keep up this facade because it ensured that its initial investors received the promised sums by using the money from new investors, and was able to further raise its credibility by both partnering with the nationalist Romanian National Unity Party and by advertising exclusively on Romanian television. Karitas was also able to profit off the fact that Romania had just begun a transition to capitalism, and as a result, many Romanians were unaware of how capitalist markets truly worked. Yet as with all Ponzi schemes, Karitas did eventually crash. And when that crash occurred in August of 1994, a total of about $8 billion vanished overnight. Number 14. The Frat House Fraud. While frat brothers are supposed to be friends for life, Syed Arham Arbab is a perfect example of how these guys sometimes turn out to be frat frauds. That's because in 2019, Syed Arbab admitted to running a Ponzi scheme that defrauded his friends, family, and frat brothers out of about $1 million in cash. Working out of the Phi Kappa Tau frat house, he claimed that he was part of the University of Georgia's MBA program and promised rates as high as 56% per year and gave the money-back guarantee on the first $15,000 invested. However, the truth of the matter is that he invested little, if any, of the money given to him, and that he had in fact been rejected from the university's MBA program when he tried to apply earlier that year. Regardless, this didn't stop him from spending most of his stolen funds recklessly, reporting using most of it to finance his escapades to local strip clubs and his several gambling trips to Vegas. Yet after about a year, he was eventually caught and ended up being sentenced to 5 years in prison as a result. Number 13. Johann Baptist Pluck. Many of the Ponzi schemes on this list are rather recent, yet the case of Johann Baptist Pluck proves that a Ponzi scheme is a con that's been around for centuries. Pluck was born in either 1833 or 1834 and worked as both an officer in the army and a bank clerk before opening up a business in 1872. Via this business, he promised investors that he could make returns of between 15 and 20% on their original investments in a short period of time by investing on the stock market. However, rather than invest the money, he simply used it to fuel his gambling addiction. He was able to keep up the charade for months by giving the money of new investors to the old ones, but eventually it fell apart by May of 1873, after he lost nearly everything that was given to him. As a result, he was convicted of fraud in 1874 and sentenced to 6 years in prison. However, for unknown reasons, he was pardoned by the Austrian emperor and made a free man in 1877. Number 12. The Mutual Benefits Corporation. While profiting off the terminally ill is generally seen as pretty scummy, Peter Lombardi managed to do so on a massive scale when he founded the Mutual Benefits Corporation in 1994. He did so by selling life insurance policies of people with AIDS, cancer, and terminal illnesses to investors, and said that while they would have to pay the premiums for between 1 to 3 years, they would see large returns once the sick people had died. However, the truth of the matter is that these people were far less sick than Lombardi claimed, and he instead used the money given to him by investors to both pay off his initial investors and live a lavish lifestyle. Yet in 2004, the scheme fell apart when the SEC caught wind of Lombardi's activities, and in 2013 was sentenced to 20 years in prison after losing about $850 million in investor funds. Number 11. Tom Petters. In 1988, Tom Petters began to take investors for a ride when he crafted a convoluted Ponzi scheme. Working with the firm Petters Company Incorporated, he told his victims that their investments would be used to purchase electronics, such as big-screen televisions that would be resold to discount retailers like Sam's Club and Costco. In reality, the purchase orders and bank records he showed potential investors were bogus, and as such, the merchandise never existed and sales never took place. Regardless, Petters began experiencing massive success, and even went so far as to buy the well-known brand Polaroid for $426 million in 2005. It was all about to fall apart eventually, and the final stroke came in 2008, when the FBI began an investigation into him. Once all was said and done, they found that $3.7 billion had been funded into his scheme, and in 2009 he was handed a 50-year prison sentence as a consequence of his crimes. Number 10. The European Kings Club. While being part of the European Kings Club may sound like a pretty sweet deal, it actually was one of the worst financial moves you could possibly make. That's because this club, which was founded in 1991, was essentially just a massive scheme that operated by selling letters that promised to pay investors 200 Swiss francs a month for just 1,400 Swiss francs each. As you might expect, these letters were completely phony, yet that didn't stop them from being sold across Switzerland, Germany, and Austria. Yet when the scam eventually fell apart in 1994, it caused investors to lose a total of almost $2 billion. This was made worse by the fact that in some parts of Switzerland, as much as 10% of the population had participated, and thus many protests began to occur when the victims began to defend the companies as they refused to believe they had been scammed. Yet their cries of protest didn't amount to much, because in 1997 ringleader Damara Bertges was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Number 9. Greater Ministries International. While religious groups are supposed to support spiritual health, they sometimes get out of hand and get involved in the financial world as well. Such was the case of the Greater Ministries International, which was a religion founded by Gerald Payne in Tampa, Florida in 1993. It was ultra-conservative in nature and eventually began to lean towards an extreme anti-government ideology known as the Patriot Movement. This led to both sovereign citizens and known white supremacists joining its ranks, and it was at this point that Payne began a crafty Ponzi scheme. Citing the Luke 6:38 verse, "Give and it shall be given unto you," in his sales pitches, he claimed that via his Double Your Money gift exchange program, Christians could double their money via his church's investments in precious metals. This led to about $500 million being pumped into the scheme, and this became problematic pretty quickly. After all, in 1998, state regulators shut down Best Bank, which is where Payne had stashed most of his money. In a scramble to produce some profits, Payne then began to invest money into creating gold and silver mines in Liberia, all of which never produced a single piece of precious metal. By 1999, the entire scheme fell apart, and at this point, Payne and his associates were promptly arrested. This ultimately led to Payne receiving a 27-year sentence, and once all the money was accounted for, it turns out that his victims lost a total of $174 million.
We're constantly adding more people to the Top 5's production team to bring you all the best content. Be sure to subscribe with notifications on and hit the like button.
Number 8. Moneytron. Of all the fraudsters on this list, Jean-Pierre Van Rossem was certainly one of the most interesting. Born in Belgium in 1945, he was a respected economist who became a Marxist while in university. This became relevant in the 70s and 80s when he ran off with the wife of a rich industrialist in order to, quote, punish capitalism by taking his wife, end quote. In order to finance her supposed shopping habit, he then set up Moneytron, which was an investment firm that supposedly had a supercomputer that was able to predict market movements. And while nobody ever got to see the machine as it was kept behind a locked door, Van Rossem's reputation for being an economic genius convinced high-profile clients like the Belgian royal family to fork over some cash. By 1989, he claimed to be managing $7 billion in assets, yet by 1990, the entire scheme fell apart, and in 1991, he was sentenced to 5 years in jail. In a bid to avoid jail time, he successfully managed to gain parliamentary immunity by founding his own libertarian protest party and gaining 3 seats in parliament in the 1991 election. However, after his 4-year term was up, he was not re-elected and ended up serving his sentence soon after. Number 7. Bitconnect. Cryptocurrencies are complicated, and while there are some legitimate ones out there, there are just as many fake coins that are created by charlatans. Such was the case of Bitconnect, which was launched in 2016. It promised returns of about 1% per day, which, while sounding reasonable at first, actually means that your money would multiply by an insanely high 3,600% per year. Now, the coin would be bought by using Bitcoin, and the return was supposedly so high because by keeping the coin, you were helping to maintain the stability of the network. You would also get higher returns by referring more people, which made it reminiscent of a pyramid scheme. Regardless, despite the red flags, many people bought into this cryptocurrency, and at its height it was trading at a price of $347 per coin. Yet in January of 2018, the coin's value plummeted to almost zero, causing its $2.6 billion market cap to nearly vanish overnight. And while some of its ringleaders have been arrested, many who were involved are still at large today. Number 6. Alan Stanford. While there have been many Ponzi schemes over the years, few have been quite as damaging as the scheme run by Alan Stanford. Born in 1950 to a lower middle-class family in Texas, he became quite wealthy by buying up cheap Texan real estate after the Texas oil bubble burst in the late 1980s. Yet the money he made during this time period was not enough for Stanford, so in 1991 he set up the Stanford Financial Group on the island of Antigua. Once established, he began to sell fake certificates of deposit from his Antiguan bank and promised consistent higher-than-market returns to his victims. Yet the truth of the matter was that he was funneling most of the money into living a luxurious lifestyle. And by the time he was caught in 2009, he had already sold a total of $18 billion in fake CDs to thousands of customers. This led him to being sentenced to 110 years in prison in 2012, and to this day, most of the money he received has not been recovered. Number 5. Charles Ponzi. Of all the Ponzi schemers out there, none are quite as famous as Mr. Ponzi himself. Born in northern Italy in 1882, he immigrated to Boston in 1903 with the hopes of striking it rich. And while he didn't exactly get to do so for about 16 years, in 1919 he realized that he could make money via arbitrage if he bought Italian postal reply coupons and exchanged them for American ones. Thus, he attempted to raise a lot of capital and did so by creating a company which promised a return of 50% after 45 days or 100% after 90 days for would-be investors. Due to his charisma, he was able to raise the modern equivalent of about $265,000 in just 1 month. And like he promised, began to pay back his initial investors. This caused him to garner quite the reputation, and thus so many people ended up investing that Ponzi was receiving the modern equivalent of almost $12 million per day by July of 1919. However, Ponzi began running into some major problems when he realized that he couldn't exchange postal reply coupons for money, and thus began to look into ways in which he could turn a profit so that the scheme wouldn't fall apart. His first attempt at doing so was trying to buy a controlling share of the Boston-based Hanover Trust Bank. The idea behind this was that he could be made president of this bank and then use its money to pay off investors. Yet this didn't end up working, and as a result he bought a macaroni company and a part of a winemaking company in hopes of turning a profit. But at this point it was already too late. By August of 1919 he had surrendered to federal authorities, and it soon became clear he had defrauded investors of the modern equivalent of about $200 million and had brought down 6 banks with him. This eventually led to him being sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, and once released, his life began to fall into a downward spiral. And unfortunately for Ponzi, when all was said and done, he ended up dying as a penniless man in Brazil at the age of 67. Number 4. Bernie Madoff. While Charles Ponzi may be the man behind the first Ponzi scheme, it was Madoff that brought it to new heights. That's because he stands apart for running the largest Ponzi scheme in human history. Now, a lot of the details around his scheme still are unclear due to his lack of cooperation with investigators. However, what we do know is that he began the scam sometime in the 1980s while running his own small company. He told investors that his investment strategy was to buy safe blue-chip stocks and then buy both calls and puts on them, ensuring that his level of risk would be minimal. However, the reality of the situation is that from at least the 90s onwards, he didn't execute a single trade and instead left his investors' funds sitting in a bank account. Now, unlike most Ponzi con men, Madoff became truly legendary by having his scheme last for nearly 30 years. This is primarily because he not only had some big clients, but also dealt primarily with charities. This exempted him from being forced to pay out 5% of his profits to the clients every year, thus allowing his scheme to have increased longevity. This is not to mention the fact that he was able to use his influence via his role as a major political donor to avoid being investigated. It was only after multiple complaints that the SEC decided to take any serious steps and investigate his accounts. Unfortunately for Madoff, it didn't take long for investigators to find that $36 billion had been put into the scam, with about $18 billion ultimately being lost by investors and a total of $10 billion likely being the net deficit. This ungodly amount of loss makes it the largest Ponzi scheme ever, and as a result, Bernie Madoff was eventually sentenced to life in prison for his actions. Number 3. Adele Spitzer. While Ponzi schemes may have gotten their name from the infamous Charles Ponzi, we'd say that calling them the Spitzer schemes would be a little more accurate. That's because by many accounts, she's one of the first to have pulled off a true Ponzi scheme. Now, Adele Spitzer was born in Berlin in February of 1832, and after attending acting school began her adult life in show business. While acting, she had a moderate success, although due to her reportedly masculine look, she eventually ran out of roles, and by late 1869 she was massively in debt. Now broke in the city of Munich, she began a Ponzi scheme by promising a 10% monthly return on all money given to her, creating a company known as the Spitzerische Privatbank. She began advertising in the newspapers and returning the investments of early investors in order to gain credibility. Due to her being a seemingly pious Catholic, she attracted the attention of the city's poor, who trusted her more than the bankers who usually handle such transactions. This was amplified by the fact that she was often very generous with the money, electing to give some of it back in food banks dedicated to the poor. Now, what's shocking about this scheme is that she promised neither to invest people's money nor to grant securities, which means that she had no source of generating revenue. However, this paradoxically made many trust her more, as they ironically had very little faith in local bankers. It didn't take long for the authorities to realize what was going on, and thus they tried to shut her down by taxing her and forcing locals to ask for their money back on various occasions. Yet time after time this would not work, as the local people were not willing to cooperate. This became especially problematic when legitimate banks became dangerously close to running out of cash and reserves in order to fund people funneling money to Spitzer. Yet after a massive public awareness campaign in late 1872, the scheme finally collapsed, and as such Spitzer was arrested, and the few dozen houses she had bought were all repossessed. When all was said and done, she had defrauded her clients out of the modern equivalent of $400 million, and this caused her to be sentenced to 3 years and 10 months in prison. And after drifting around from city to city, she eventually ended up dying of a cardiac arrest at the age of 63. Number 2. Ivar Krueger. Most con men try to avoid the government as much as possible, yet Ivar Krueger turned the tables by choosing several countries as his clients. Born in Sweden in 1880, he rose to fame in the match industry, eventually coming to have a monopoly over Scandinavia's match sector via his company Swedish Match. And while he engaged in plenty of swindles during his time in business, his most infamous came between 1925 and 1930. That's because it was during this period that he began to give loans out to countries in exchange for being given rights to that country's entire match industry. These loans totaled a modern equivalent of about $4.5 billion and allowed him to expand to 36 countries, have monopolies in 16 of them, and control 40% of the world's match production. Yet while this may seem like old-fashioned capitalism, the reality was actually much different. That's because in order to finance his government loans, he began offering participating debentures, or essentially shares that had an obligation to pay out interest in the double digits. However, the government's loans he was handing out only amounted to interest in the single digits, and thus he had to use money from new investors in order to pay the old ones back. He did this by using both Swedish Match and a medley of over 400 subsidiary companies, all of which were able to hide the fact that Krueger did not have enough money to pay investors back. As such, after the stock market crash of 1929, he knew the end was near, and in 1932 he elected to commit suicide before he could be apprehended by authorities. This caused a massive market reaction known as the Krueger crash. Several banks went out of business as a result. Yet the deadliest fall of them all was Swedish Match itself, who thanks to its bankruptcy went on to lose investors the modern equivalent of about $3.75 billion. Number 1. The MMM Corporation. Thankfully, the majority of the Ponzi schemes on this list were prosecuted against long ago. Yet the MMM Corporation stands apart due to the fact that it's still in business today. It was founded by Sergei Mavrovdy, his brother Vyacheslav Mavrovdy, and Olga Melnikova in 1989, soon after Russia's transition to capitalism. It started out as a computer importing cooperative. However, once that business began to fall apart, MMM began working in the financial sector. While doing so, they began to sell privatization vouchers, in which they offered shares which they promised would increase in value by 3,000%. Because Russia had just emerged from communism, many of its citizens were unaware of financial scams, and thus began buying MMM stock en masse. This was fueled by the MMM Corporation's intensive ad campaign, where they used ordinary folk heroes to promote shares while also pulling off promotions. However, the 3,000% returns they promised were absolutely impossible, and they soon began to expand to even shadier territory by creating new companies that offered stocks that promised 30,000% returns. In 1994, the Russian government charged them with selling false securities, yet ringleader Sergei Morovdy was able to evade capture by becoming an elected politician and gaining parliamentary immunity. Yet he only showed up to the State Duma once, and even then it was only in order to vote against the government waiving his immunity. While this political debacle bought him some time, he was eventually arrested by Russian police in 2003 and ended up serving about 4 years in jail. Yet after being released, he chose to continue the business by exporting his operations to developing countries. More specifically, Sergei marketed MMM across impoverished regions of Africa and Asia, where he promised monthly returns on investment of up to 30%. Unsurprisingly, the money that was pumped in never returned to the hands of investors, but despite this, he was never prosecuted in those countries. Thus, despite having a small hiccup after Sergei's death in 2018, MMM continues to run an international Ponzi scheme to this day.
Watch our binge-watching playlist if you'd like to watch all of our most popular top 15 videos. Grab a drink, grab a snack, and get ready to binge.